chats. I'm going to look at all that shit as well. So let's make this a good lecture. So anyway, so here is the lecture that we're going to be dealing with. And this actually, when I was working on this lecture, I actually was I noted that it was so much more information that needed to be placed out there. And so this lecture, which was initially scheduled to be a 2-part series, turned into a 3-part series fairly quickly. So because there's just so much content, and I think it is so important to address the entire perspective of it. So this lecture is entitled Childhood Loss, Children and Jim Crow America, Part 1. Some of you may be familiar with the young man who is on the slide. That is George Stinney Jr. And in 1944, George Stinney was convicted of killing a couple of white girls. And he was the youngest person in U.S. history to ever be charged with death, convicted of death, to the death penalty for this type of thing. Now, it's a lot behind that. We'll talk about this more as we go into the lecture. Childhood Loss, Children in Jim Crow America, Part 1. So, here's the thing. In American history, I think it's important for us, when we study it, to talk about the truth and to teach the story from a true perspective, not omitting anything just because it makes someone looks bad, not painting it out to be something it wasn't, but focusing on the truth. And the reality of it is, in this American experience, being black has been an interesting experience, has been a difficult experience, has been a challenging experience, has been rewarding. There's been a lot to it. It's just been, consistently throughout our history, we've had to endure a lot of things. But the truth about what happened to black children under Jim Crow should never be hidden. These children's lives matter, and this conversation should happen. This isn't just a story of the past, right? This is a story, it is a map of how inequality was passed down, written into laws, schools, prisons, and ultimately into American culture. And for those of you who are thinking that this was so long ago, this was not that long ago. Some of these kids that we're going to talk about, some of these kids who were around during this time, some of them are still around today as elderly adults. So this is very, 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 very current history. This isn't just a story of the past. It's a map. It's a map. But it begins not in adulthood, but childhood. Because for black children, childhood was often, many times, stolen. Unlike their white counterparts, these kids didn't get a chance to experience adolescence. Didn't get a chance to experience innocence and coming of age. And, I think of movies like Stand By Me and all these coming of age stories, Juno, even though that was an interesting story. This just wasn't the experience of these black children, and their stories are a lot different. And so we'll talk about it. Take note of some of the pictures. Some of the pictures I'll draw attention to, but these are pictures from the time period to which we are discussing in the lecture. So pay attention to some of the pictures. And if you have comments or questions, you can ask them in the chat. I don't have the chat up yet because, like I said, I'm new to this, but I'm sure the chat is able to be used and utilized, especially out here on Twitch. So use it if you have questions. I'll be happy to answer. I also will post the resources because I believe evidence is important. I don't believe you can have a conversation about history or any really academic or scholarly discussion without having resources and sources on top of sources. And so, of course, you will have resources to use as a complement to the lecture, but also just to further your own investigation into Black American history. All right, so between 1890 in 1940, which is the first part we're talking about here, black children weren't seen as children. They were forced into labor, they were punished by law, and they were even erased from textbooks and by mobs. Black children's lives didn't matter during the Jim Crow period. Childhood, which for many of us it's a sacred time of protection and growth, and where we're coming to ourselves and coming into terms of the realities to which we live, was something that they had to fight for. These kids had to fight for their childhood. What we're going to explore today in this lecture, friends, family, loved ones, what we're going to explore today is not just injustice, okay? But it's design. These things were intentional. This wasn't just happenstance. It didn't just happen to them. This is something that was intentionally done by design. Systems were built to deny them their innocence. Systems were built to deny them opportunity. And in many ways, these same very systems were built to deny them even their lives. It's Jim Crow America, 1890. And Jim Crow, by the way, for those of you who don't know, the term Jim Crow came from a minstrel show. Minstrel show was blackface. It was, and we'll probably do lectures on blackface too, because it is a fascinating subject. Because what blackface is white people imitating what they think black people are for over 100 years. And it gives a good insight into that experience. But what Jim Crow was it was named after the minstrel character Jim Crow by Daddy Rice, an actor who wore blackface in the 1830s and 40s. And we named the entire era as historians. Post the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in the Supreme Court that said as long as facilities and public facilities were equal, they could be separate. But the reality of it is that they weren't equal. So that's why we needed a civil rights movement. That's why we needed a Brown Board of Education, which we'll talk about in this lecture series. Because it wasn't equality. It was subhuman for a lot of them. There was definitely a two-tier justice system. There was definitely second-class citizenship for black people. So the era, Jim Crow era, lasts from 1890 after the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, and it lasts all the way to about 1970. Some historians put it to about 1980, but I roughly stop it at a 1970 when it was officially we start to see the traces and residue of the Jim Crow era begin to start to be dismantled. All right, so here's some of the things that we're going to look at. By the way, I think that's important. Go back to my previous slide. Between 1890 and 1940, black children, like I said, weren't seen as children at all. Some of the things that we're going to focus on today are going to be how laws were passed to separate and to control, how schools were unequal by design, how child labor and prison systems intentionally targeted black youth, and how black families and communities resisted, protected, and survived in this moment. Because this isn't a woe is us, pity on me, look at what happened to us story. I always see the story of the black American experience from slavery on forward to be the greatest American story of overcoming and growth that can ever exist. Because no one in this country can say, hey, we started out as slaves, started from the bottom, now we're here, And so there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but comparatively to where we were, we have made quite a few strides, and I am proud of that. So when I tell these stories, I'm not telling these stories as a victim, victim mentality. I'm telling these stories to empower my people, to empower young people, to empower future American leaders of all kinds, to know the history and have it written on their hearts. All other cultures have their histories on their hearts, but we as black people are told not to. So hopefully this is something that this lecture series and Black History Live is something that allows people to start to put the history on their hearts. But we'll also ground this in real stories. So this is just not an arbitrary thing. These are actual real people who really existed. People like George Stinney Jr., who was on the front of the title slide. And these and overlooked patterns like the rise of child chain gangs. We'll talk about schooling, all these things. This is about truth telling, not trauma chasing. But the truth deserves to be known. So let's get involved. Let's go. And by the way, this is a picture of children in school during the Jim Crow era. All right. So what is Jim Crow? I mentioned it in passing just a minute ago, but let's get into a deep dive. After the Civil War, there was a period of 11 years called the Reconstruction period, right? From 1865, the end of the Civil War, to about 1873. Is my numbers correct? 65, sorry. Yeah, to about 1873, 11 years. There was this period called Reconstruction. Now, those of you who don't know the Civil War will probably we will definitely do a lecture on the Black experience during the American Civil War. But the American Civil War was the worst time in United States history. Over 650,000 people lost their lives. Some people put that number as high as 720,000, making it our most death in one war in United States history, more death than all other wars we've ever had in this country combined. So it's a lot. The Civil War was tense. And in simple, the Civil War was about whether or not we were going to have slavery or whether or not we were going to not have slavery. That's what the Civil War was about.